Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are finally able to check out the Zen 4 3D V-Cache CPU that you're actually interested in, the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, and boy is it fast and extremely power efficient. But before we get to all the exciting graphs, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by PowerColor and their Red Devil RX 7900 series of graphics cards. Designed for 4K gaming, the Red Devil series ensures optimal performance with low temperatures and whisper quiet operation. And although cool and quiet gaming is the priority, PowerColor aren't afraid to do it in style, allowing gamers to customize the look of their Red Devil 7900 series graphics card with Devil skins. They're uniquely designed backplates. Devil skins are extremely easy to attach with pre-installed magnets, and currently gamers can choose from the generative skin for a hellish appearance or the intrusive skin for those of you who are after something a bit more subtle. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Now, for whatever reason, AMD decided that it would be a good idea to delay the release of the 7800X 3D and instead lead with the 7950X 3D and 7900X 3D, both of which arrived back in February. The 7950X 3D was by no means a bad product, but it's a very niche product that doesn't really make sense from a pure gaming standpoint, certainly not in terms of value anyway. With just one of the two CCDs armed with 3D V-Cache, the 16-core 7950X 3D is heavily reliant on Windows to address the correct core complex die, and that didn't always happen, and it still doesn't. Therefore, to ensure maximum performance, gamers are best off disabling the second CCD in the BIOS, essentially turning the 7950X 3D into a 7800X 3D, but paying $700 US for the privilege. Thankfully, the 7800X 3D is now here, so rather than paying $700 US for the 16-core version and then turning it into a 7800X 3D, you can now buy the 7800X 3D for $450 US, so that is a much better situation for interested buyers. The 7800X 3D is actually a really interesting prospect at $450, as that makes it just $50 more than the 7700X, but also $120 more than the non-X version, so the plain old Ryzen 7 7700. It's also priced to compete with the Core i7 13700K, which can currently be had for $420, while the more desirable 13900K is up around $580 US. Now, for this review, I've had to update all of our already very fresh data, and this is because NVIDIA recently changed the way their GeForce drivers behave by disabling resizable bar in games such as Horizon Zero Dawn, and I believe Spider-Man Remastered as well, and this has resulted in big performance gains for Intel CPUs in those games. And there are also a few other small performance changes here and there, so I just decided to retest everything, including the AM4 and AM5 processors, so this was a massive undertaking with not a whole lot of time to do it. So, along with the latest GeForce drivers, using the RTX 4090, I've also updated all of the board's BIOS revisions, and I've moved the LJ 1700 test system over to the Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Elite AX motherboard using DDR5 7200 CL34 memory. As for the AM5 test system, that's still using the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master with DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, as that is the fastest memory that will work with all Zen 4 processors. Okay, let's get into the data. Right, so before we jump into the benchmark graphs, here's a look at clock behavior of the 7800X 3D in Cinebench R23 all-core workload. Under this load, the CPU sustained an average clock frequency of 4.8 GHz and a peak operating temperature of 84 degrees, which is very cool for a Zen 4 processor. Then, running just the single-core test, we saw a sustained frequency of 5 GHz, that's just 200 MHz over what we saw for the all-core workload, and the peak operating temperature dropped down to 66 degrees, so pretty good results there, though it is only a single-core workload. Okay, so when running the all-core workload in Cinebench R23, the 7800X 3D is seen to be 8% slower than the 7700X, and a massive 21% slower than the 13600K, and then 37% slower than the 13700K. So in terms of value, this will be a pretty poor offering for productivity, and at this price point, you'd certainly be better off with the Core i7 13700K. The biggest drawback of the 3D V-Cache technology is the fact that the cores typically have to clock lower. The 7950X 3D was able to get around this by running the Cinebench R23 single-core workload on the second, higher-clocked non-3D V-Cache enabled CCD, but the 7800X 3D doesn't have that luxury. So the single core score drops to just 1816 points, which is a 30% boost from the 5800X 3D, but 8% slower than the 7700X. Now, despite everything we just saw, in Photoshop 2022, the 7800X 3D performs quite well, matching the 7950X 3D with a score of 1481 points, though that meant it was still 5% slower than the 7700X. Now, I suspect that the 7950X 3D is using the 3D Vcache enabled CCD for this workload, which is why the 7800X 3D offered a similar level of performance. Moving on, we have the Blender Open Data benchmark, and this is a core-heavy workload that isn't efficiently accelerated by Intel's E-cores, and as a result, the 13600K was just 11% faster in this example, though the 13700K did maul the 7800X 3D by a whopping 44% margin. So again, if you're interested in productivity performance, then the 7800X 3D, it's just not going to be for you. This is a pure gaming CPU, unless of course your workload does benefit from having the 3D Vcache, which isn't the case here in Blender. Where the 7800X 3D is really impressive is when it comes to power consumption. The 13600K, for example, it was 11% faster in this benchmark, but for that extra performance, we saw a whopping 52% increase in total system power consumption, and that is total system power consumption. The 13700K, on the other hand, that was 44% faster, but here we can see it consumes 89% more power, and that again is total system power. So in terms of efficiency, the 7950X 3D is actually amazing here, and the 7800X 3D is also great for the levels of performance it delivers. Okay, on to some gaming benchmarks, and quite disappointingly, the 7950X 3D is still broken in the Factorio benchmark. Now, if you manually disable the second CCD, it can match what we're seeing here from the 7800X 3D, but failing to do so sees the game run on the second CCD, and performance is drastically reduced. Anyway, this is a good example of the performance-related issues you can avoid with the 7800X 3D, so having just a single 3D Vcache-enabled CCD means the game or program always has access to the larger L3 cache. So in this example, the 7800X 3D is 22% faster than the 5800X 3D, 55% faster than the 13900K, 72% faster than the 13700K, and 77% faster than the 7700X. Next up, we have Hogwarts Legacy with ray tracing enabled, and here the 7800X 3D does quite well, edging out the 13900K by a 3% margin, so performance overall is much the same between these two parts. When compared to the similarly priced 13700K, you are getting a much more noteworthy 11% performance boost. Meanwhile, the 7950X 3D is clocked a little more aggressively, resulting in a minor 3% performance bump over the 7800X 3D. As for power consumption, I'm going to show total system usage, as I feel this is more relevant to someone looking at buying this CPU, or any CPU for that matter. These results are heavily influenced by performance, as in how many frames the RTX 4090 is able to spit out, so do keep that in mind. Having said all of that though, the 7800X 3D was 3% faster than the 1300K in this game, while using 20% less power. And again, that is total system usage, not just CPU package power or something like that. So that is a big deal when it comes to thermal output and just the general consumption of the computer. Now, moving on to Spider-Man Remastered, here the 7800X 3D is again very impressive, though not quite as impressive as the 7950X 3D was. Again, the slightly higher clock 7950X 3D was able to deliver 4% greater performance in this example, hitting an impressive 164 FPS. Even so, the 7800X 3D was 9% faster than the 13900K, and remember, the Core i9 processor has been paired with DDR5 7200 memory, which really helps in this bandwidth-sensitive game. And here's another look at total system power consumption. In Spider-Man, the 7800X 3D saw total system load hit 339 watts, which is a 28% reduction when compared to the 13900K, which is quite incredible given that the AMD processor was 9% faster. Now, I've been asked by some members of the driving simulator community to change the way that I test ACC, moving away from the medium preset towards epic. So that's what I've done here, and this has led to some interesting results which verify what some sim racers have been reporting. Whereas the 13900K and 7950X 3D were neck and neck using the medium settings, the more demanding epic settings indeed hand the Zen 4 part a massive 31% win. Oddly though, the 7950X 3D is 11% faster than the 7800X 3D, which is a much bigger margin than I was expecting to see, but after triple checking the results, they are accurate. Even so, this meant that the 7800X 3D is 18% faster than the 13900K, 21% faster than the 5800X 3D, 25% faster than the 13700K, and 38% faster than the 7700X. Sadly, I haven't gone back and recorded power usage for this particular game, as this was something I went back and looked at for half a dozen of the games tested before running out of time, so I guess 6 games will have to do for those power figures. And next up we do have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and here the 7800X3D was the fastest CPU tested, pumping out an impressive 330 FPS, making it 6% faster than the 7950X3D and 13% faster than the 13900K. We're also looking at a rather substantial 27% boost over the 7700X. Now, I did measure total system usage for this game, and here the 7800X3D configuration consumes slightly more power than the 7700X, a 4% rise, but remember, we did see a 27% increase in performance, so the 3D V-cache part was significantly more efficient. It also consumed 21% less power than the 13900K, despite delivering 13% more performance. So while the 1300K was quite impressive in terms of performance, power efficiency is just horrible. As we found previously in the 7950X3D review, that CPU just kind of sucks in Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Extraction, and AMD hasn't been able to address this issue. The 7800X3D on the other hand, well, that ran just fine, although performance is really no better than the 7700X, at least it's not worse I guess. It was also 9% faster than the 13900K, though I think it is fair to say that every CPU tested here was more than fast enough. The 3D V-cache enabled Zen 4 CPUs are brutally fast in Watch Dogs Legion, with the 7800X3D pumping out 211 FPS, making it just 1.5% slower than the 7950X3D, but 15% faster than the 13900K, and then 19% faster than the 13700K and 5800X3D. We're also looking at a 25% boost over the 7700X. Now, Hitman 3, this game doesn't run particularly well on Zen 4 processors, at least relative to Intel's Raptor Lake series. The 7800X3D, for example, was just 4% faster than the 7700X, and that meant it was 11% slower than the 13900K and 8% slower than the 13700K, so not a great result here for AMD's new 3D V-cache part. That said, if we look at power consumption, the 7800X3D still looks pretty good despite the lackluster FPS performance. Pushing total system usage to 416 watts meant that the 7800X3D configuration consumed 26% less power than the 13900K and 21% less than the 13700K. Even with the recent update to the GeForce drivers, which disable resizable bar in Horizon Zero Dawn for Intel processors, the 7800X3D was still faster than the 13900K, delivering 6% more performance in this example. Not exactly a huge difference, but previous GeForce drivers did hand AMD a very significant advantage in this game. The 7800X3D was also just 7% faster than the 7700X, so 3D V-cache really isn't helping much here. Cyberpunk 2077 has been tested with ray tracing enabled, and here the 7800X3D basically matched the 7950X3D while producing similar numbers to that of the 13900K, though the 1% lows were a bit stronger for the AMD processor. Still, we are mostly GPU limited in this test, but with a strong call for more RT benchmarks in our CPU reviews, we decided to make some changes here. That said, I did still test the game using the medium preset with RT disabled, and while I won't bother showing those results here, I will report that scaling was pretty much the same as what we're looking at. What is interesting are the power consumption results. Despite delivering basically identical performance to that of the 13900K, the Core i9 system consumed 25% more power than the 7800X3D system, and that is a shocking difference, it has to be said. Like Hitman 3, the Riftbreaker is a game where Zen 4 processors aren't particularly impressive. Here the 7800X3D managed 225 FPS on average, making the 13700K 2% faster, which does mean that performance between these two parts was basically identical, but it also means that the 13900K was 8% faster. Again, not horrible margins by any means, but the new 3D V-cache part was slower here. Another bad title for the new 3D V-cache processors is Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Basically, the game doesn't require any more L3 cache. The standard processors have more than enough for this game. Rather, the issue here is CPU frequency, so clocking the 7800X3D slower resulted in a massive 19% performance loss to the 7700X. Last up we have a Plague Tale Requiem, and here the 7800X3D is fine, though I suspect we're again system bottlenecked at around 150 FPS. It was basically able to match the Raptor Lake parts, offering a mild 14% boost over the standard Zen 4 part. In this example, Intel's Core i9-13900K pushed total system usage just 16% higher than the 7800X 3D, and while that was still a 73 watt increase in power draw, it's by no means the worst result that we've seen. But of course, given that performance was basically identical, consuming an additional 73 watts is not a good result for Intel. Okay, so here's the 12 game average. The 7800X 3D basically matched the 7950X 3D in the end, making it just 3% faster than the 1300K. So while that's technically a win for AMD, I think it is fair to say that overall performance is much the same. The 13900K gains around 5% more performance on average when going from DDR5 6400 to 7200 memory, so if we were to pair the Intel processor with the more affordable DDR5 memory, the 7800X 3D would be around 7 to 8% faster. When compared to the 13700K, we're looking at a 6% performance uplift, which is still pretty small overall, and then just an 11% boost over the standard 7700X. Of course, there are examples where the performance uplift was far more substantial, but there are also examples where we saw basically no performance uplift. You might also find this graph interesting. Here's a look at the total system power consumption averaged across the 6 games where we looked at power usage. I've also included the average frame rate performance for the 6 games that we're looking at. And as you can see, on average, the 7800X 3D was just 2.5% faster than the 1300K in this dataset. But the Core i9 processor pushed total system consumption 28% higher. Then when compared to the 7700X, the 7800X 3D was on average 13% faster in these games while using about 4% less power. So the 7800X 3D isn't just very fast for gaming, it's also extremely power efficient. Okay, time for some cost per frame data, and right off the bat, I'm going to have to highlight the fact that I'm not including the cheaper, but just as effective non-X Ryzen processors, and there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, adding another 3 processors to the testing would have required time that I simply didn't have, and on top of that, I'd then have to include the non-K Intel processors, and before you know it, the total number of CPUs tested has quickly doubled. Having said all of that though, if the data was vital to this review, I would have included it, but realistically, most people considering something like the 7800X 3D for gaming are after a non-compromise type solution, and therefore will likely only be considering a high-end CPU that offers maximum performance. You can also make your own pricing adjustments. The 7700, for example, it's about 5% slower than the 7700X, so just reduce the performance shown here from 199 FPS to say 190 FPS, and then recalculate with your updated pricing. Anyway, comparing with the higher end models, the 7800X 3D comes out at a cost per frame of $2.03, placing it alongside the 7700X and 13700K in terms of value. This also means that it's 25% better value than the 13900K and 36% better value than the 7950X 3D. That said though, we should probably recalculate with the motherboard and memory pricing included, so a total system cost analysis then. With AM5, you're faced with having to pay at least $260 US for an entry-level X670E motherboard, while usable B650 boards start at $140. But since I want to compare high-end platforms and Intel's Z690 and Z790 pricing is much the same at around $200, I thought it was only fair to evaluate the cost per frame of AM5 using an X670E motherboard. So for AM5, I'm using the $260 US ASRock X670E PG Lightning, which I know to be a good motherboard. And then of course we're factoring in the price of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, which comes out at $140 right now. Then for Intel, there are multiple Z690 and Z790 motherboards available for $200 US, while the DDR5 7200 memory that we use to achieve these results costs $205 US. And this means you could save around $60 on the Intel build by opting for DDR5 6400, but performance will be reduced by around 5%. Also, you can save $120 US on the AMD AM5 build by going with an entry-level B650 board, but you'll be dropping a large number of features by doing so. So with those values all punched into our graph, this is what we find. The 7800X 3D combo comes out to a cost of $3.84, making it one of the best value high-end combos, or rather the best value high-end combo. It's a few percent cheaper than the 13700K, and it's 17% cheaper than the 13900K, saving you around $135 US. So there you have it, the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is one of the fastest gaming CPUs on the market right now. It's also the most power efficient while offering a high level of value at $450 US. There are certainly better value deals out there, such as the Ryzen 7 7700 Non-X or even the 7600, but they're also slower. So when it comes to sort of top tier gaming performance, the value of the 7800X3D just can't be beaten right now. You could also throw this thing on the absolute cheapest AM5 motherboard you can find. We're talking around $100 here, and the 7800X3D will still perform as shown in this review. And that's not something you can say about the Core i9 1300K, which is a MOSFET imploder on low-end boards. Well, that's not necessarily true, you're just heavily power limited, which will degrade performance. And don't get me wrong, the 13900K is still a mighty impressive processor and a terrific gaming CPU, but it's not without its flaws. The need for expensive DDR5 memory to roughly match the 7800X3D does hurt its value, though it has to be said it will still get reasonably close with much cheaper memory. So as I see it, the real issue here is power consumption and of course platform longevity. Those total system power figures when gaming were quite shocking, and they explain why the 13900K still manages to run so hot in demanding games. It just sucks down a tremendous amount of power for a CPU. When it comes to productivity though, the 13900K is simply in a different league, as is the 13700K. Though I should note both are extremely power hungry for all-core productivity workloads, and they really do need to be power limited. And at that point, I think you're better served by the 7950X or 7950X3D, which typically deliver a similar level of performance to that of a non-power limited i7 or i9, while reducing total system usage by half, which is a staggering difference. And then there's platform support. Spending $200 on an LGA 1700 board to pair it with a 1300K means your next CPU upgrade will require a new motherboard. And this won't necessarily be the case with a $260 AM5 board, and this goes a long way in helping you swallow that price premium. I still don't like it. I think AM5 boards are far too expensive, especially those X670 boards, but the fact that a Zen 5 CPU will be a viable upgrade on the same board should end up being a seriously big deal. But I guess we'll find out next year. And then support beyond that, not entirely sure, but I think we will get another CPU series on that board, but of course we'll just have to wait and see what AMD does there. At the end of the day though, I think it is quite clear to say that arguing about which is the fastest gaming CPU is just a complete waste of time. These new Zen 4 3D V-Cache parts or the Core i9 1300K, it very much is a waste of time. The definition of time wasting in my opinion. They're just both very fast CPUs, and there's no chance any gamer will be able to tell them apart when actually gaming. Unless they stick their hand in the case, I suppose, then you might notice that extra 100 watts or so of the i9. In short, the Ryzen 7 7800X3D has impressed me with its performance, but I'm certainly not blown away. It's not miles more powerful than processors we already had, but I guess if anything's blown me away, it's how power efficient this thing is. But how much gamers actually care about that? Kind of hard to say. I guess that's something that we'll poll with the audience after these reviews go live, just to get a bit of a feel for that. And I guess that's where I will end this review. If you enjoyed it, give it one of those, subscribe for more. We're going to have heaps of benchmarks coming up with this CPU. Probably do like a 30 plus game benchmark comparing it with maybe the 5800X3D, various Intel CPUs. Heap of content coming up around this processor. So yeah, make sure you subscribe for that. Also, if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, you can sign up to Floatplane or Patreon. Either one of those will give you access to our exclusive Discord server for members only, monthly live stream with Tim and myself where you can ask us questions live, we'll answer those, Q&A series where we do much of the same but not live, and behind the scenes content. So yeah, a lot of cool stuff there. Check it out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.